Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name's Mark Davidson. I'm in charge of education for Wine Australia here in North America. I'm thrilled that you've all taken time to wake up to Paul Craco's legs. No, in all fairness, it's great that you're here. I'm going to do a few of the housekeeping things. This is a platform that maybe some of you have used before, Webinar Jam, perhaps not. It's not the most common platform, but it is one that we use. There's a refresh button for you guys. If you, for some reason, get kicked out or there's an issue, just hit that refresh button. Chat and Q&A functionality is operational. Please use the chat function to talk amongst yourselves if you've got questions or comments amongst yourselves. But for the Q&A, use that for questions for myself or the panelists. We will use that. We're monitoring that, and we'll do our best to get to the questions. And we'll flag it. So the session is recorded. We're going to send out a link afterwards. Also, bear in mind we've got a couple of maps up here which we may flick to. Bear in mind though that please take some time at some point and go to AustralianWineDiscovered.com. That's our education website with all sorts of fantastic information that also talks about blends within the various varieties of Shiraz, Cab, and Grenache. Cool. If you all wouldn't mind muting at your end, that is the participants, that'd be great. I don't know that, I think you're automatically muted, so it shouldn't be an issue, but just wanted to mention that to be sure. We've got a wonderful group of people that have gotten up early in some cases, and in some cases not, from right across the US to talk about blends. And I'll talk a bit about why we've picked that subject in a moment, but let me start with some introductions. I don't know where Tonya appears on your screen, but you can see Tonya. Tonya is San Francisco based. She's from the Midwest originally, but she's San Francisco based. She's a food and wine consultant and speaker. Certified through the Quartermaster Sommelier. She's known for catapulting wineries into mainstream throughout her extensive career. As a sommelier and wine director at One Market, which she was there for many years and still consults, her wine program received numerous Wine Spectator awards. She's a philanthropist, mentor, and leader for diversity and inclusion. She established Women in Wine, serves as an advisory board member for Wine Unify, and is a member of Les Dames d'Escoffier International. She's a core committee member of Batonage Forum Mentorship Program. She's also a board member for the United Sommelier Foundation. Her appearances include judging the San Francisco International Wine Competition, speaking at the CIA Summit, that's the Culinary Institute of America, not the other organization, and has also been featured in many media articles. And I first met Tonya many years ago when I was doing a Wine Australia Aussie wine program. And I thought she's pretty cool because she can't list Australian wines on her list, but she wanted to come and learn about Australian wine. And I thought, I like this woman. She's got some good ideas. So welcome, Tonya. Thank you for getting up at the crack of dawn, San Francisco time. Paul, whose legs you've seen. Paul's bio is an interesting one. He was birthed in Toronto, Canada, suckled by Margaret Greco. Raised by a family of moose in the Northwest Territories, they prefer to remain nameless. He learned to skate on a frozen pond before falling into that pond and never skating again. Followed the Bay City Rollers on tour in 1976. One of the things that is actually disappointing me about Paul. His first experience of wine was at the wedding at Ghana. Wine tasted thin, he complained. Slept with a 2x4 for 2 years to better understand oak, and that's a mantra that he's kept in terms of understanding things in general in the future. He's just exited Scream Therapy so that he could relearn all there is to know about wine. Paul and your legs, welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
James Tidwell. Many of us know James. He's the co-founder of arguably one of the world's leading wine education conferences, that's TEXSOM, and also owner of one of the United States' most prestigious wine competitions, the TEXSOM International Wine Awards. Member of the editorial committee of the Classic Wine Library, speaker, freelance journalist whose work has appeared in the World of Fine Wine, Lonely Planet, and others, and is the former beverage director with Four Seasons Hotels and Resorts. In 2019, he was nominated for Person of the Year in the Wine Enthusiast magazine's Wine Star Awards. James, welcome. Now you're muted, it seems. Click back on. You're not. We have no sound for you, James. Try again. Okay, we'll try and get that sorted, James. Keep trying on that one. I'm not quite sure what's going on here. I will go through the a little bit of an idea of why we've gathered here today and why we've in fact picked this particular theme and the reason for this session. Blends have always been part of wine history. If you think back historically, there's always, wines have been blends of different parcels of wine from different areas. So it's not something that's new. I think it's gone through its ups and downs of interest from a consumer standpoint, and that's kind of why we picked this. But what we thought we'd do, there's a bunch of angles we could have come at from this for Australia, but I think this sort of historical significance of blends has led us to where we've sort of looked at, we're going to try and look at it through the lens of 3 classic styles and see how they've evolved, and also talk about the regionality that surrounds that. Historically, one of the most famous wines in Australia is a multi-regional blend. So there is that element. It's from region to region, and just having access to, sometimes the bigger companies have access to sometimes the best parcels of fruit, and they craft exquisite wines that way. Grange is a fantastic example of that. Then we have these varietal blends, which I think is a really interesting piece of the puzzle for Australia, in the sense that our wines historically would have been named according to styles, if you like. And the blend wasn't insignificant because the varieties that were going into that blend sort of formed the style, but it wasn't about varietal labeling in those days. And I think it was Jane Ferrari, who I know, Tonya, you know well and have had good chats with. She talked about some of the criteria for the old school wine show system, which sort of explained a little bit about the naming, because the naming conventions with Australia followed the lines of places like California and the United States as well, in the sense that we use the word Burgundy and Claret and Hermitage. We didn't say Hermitage because that was too fancy. Good morning, James. Can we hear you now?
I hope so.
Yes, we can. Beautiful.
It holds.
There you go. So, but yeah, there was the way the systems worked. It would be, if you were a dry red category and with a soft finish, that would be Burgundy in Australia. That's how the history went. If it was a firm finish, it was a dry red wine firm finish, you went for Claret, and that's kind of how the styles went. So it wasn't so much what was in those blends; it was more about the style themselves. Now, the sort of the Burgundy style of blend in those days tended to be somewhat Grenache dominant, or Grenache featured in there, just because of that softer sort of style. So that sort of varietal blend has always been part of the Australian history for decades now. And then you've also got, in fairness, you've also got varietally the same but different parcels. For example, Coonawarra Cabernet, even though it's changed quite a bit in the last couple of decades, Coonawarra Cabernet was always 100% Cabernet. It wasn't so much about other things blending in to make the Cabernet interesting. It was about the different parcels of different ages. Wynns to this day still does that. So the different parcels of Cabernet. So blending's always been part and parcel of that. What I think is interesting, though, is that if you look at statistics across the US now, people talk very heavily about, wow, red blends are really popular. And that has to come with a caveat, which is why I think we focused in on this today, because the red blends that are very popular now, according to the statistics, are a very different caliber and style. They are more sort of commercially driven, is sort of the wrong word, but more sort of mass market wines, if you like, higher end price points. But things like Apothic and various other brands have done very, very well by just marketing themselves as blends. And I love that on one hand, because there was a period of time that I think all of us can remember where the average consumer sort of looked down. There was a period like, oh, blends. No, I don't want to blend. We were all varietally obsessed, and we wanted a Cabernet from Napa or a Shiraz from Barossa or whatever it was. Now that's not the case. People like the idea of red blends. However, the caveat for us is that this is not what we have done historically, nor what we're doing currently. Blends for us circulate around a bunch of things, and we're going to look at 3 historical blends. The Cab Shiraz blend, which there are people today that still believe that's one of the great expressions of dry red wine in Australia. I'm not saying I agree or disagree with that. But a classic style. The Grenache dominant blends, or Grenache based blends, be it Grenache Shiraz, Grenache Shiraz Mourvedre, but that Grenache piece of the puzzle, which is the classic sort of Rhone blends. And then the other piece of the puzzle, which are those Cabernet dominant blends that have been modeled on the style of Bordeaux, but we've taken our own sort of take on that. We could have looked at natural wine, because natural wines have been a lovely opening into what makes style more important than the varieties themselves? And we could look at that. We could look at Pet Nats. We could look at Shiraz Viognier. But let's just focus on 3 classic styles and see where we go from there. See how they were created, and also where we end up with. So with that in mind, I know, Tonya, you had a lovely chat with Jane Ferrari. A few of you have met Jane. She's traveled the US. She was the brand ambassador, or the traveling, educating sort of Barossa oracle for Yalumba for many years. She's now independent right now, but she was a great person to give you some background on what's going on with Cab Shiraz, and you were completely and utterly taken by her at Decanted last year. So it was a lovely fit. So I'm going to let you launch in.
So what has always struck me has been the wines of Australia and the people. Unlike the others on the panel, I've never been to Australia, but very long ago, I became enamored with the wines and was able to have them on early wine lists, but not so much on my current wine list until recently, where things just kind of exploded. But in talking about the history of Australia, James Busby was a viticulturalist and an explorer, and he went to France and Spain and Portugal, talking to different viticulturalists and gathering plant matter, if you would, and brought that plant matter back to Australia in the early 1880s. And this is why, we have Shiraz and Cabernet, as well as other great varieties in Australia. Australia was really well known for fortified wines, brandy, if you would, sherry, ports, which they're still really well known for, but it really wasn't until, I'd say, the 1960s and 70s that we started to see and hear more about dry wines, red and white wines. Even when people were producing fortified wines, there were the outliners that were producing dry reds and dry white wines. And one of those leaders was the Yalumba family in Barossa. There's also a huge push coming from the Coonawarra as well. The signature, which is what I'm tasting today, is a blend of 60 Cabernet and 40 Shiraz. And depending upon the vintage and the year, that changes just a little bit. But what I'm really struck by with these blends is the silkiness that the Shiraz brings into a blend and into a bottle of wine. The Cabernet is such that it's more black fruit driven, black licorice, if you would. I always seem to get the kind of rocky clay, red clay that comes through. I like to think of the Coonawarra as being like a layer cake to look at the soil composition there. And so when I'm actually tasting these wines from the Barossa and the Coonawarra, that's kind of what I imagine and I see in my mind as well. But it's just really lovely. And it's just amazing, the history of the country and the region. And I don't think a lot of people realize that after World War I, essentially Australia became bankrupt, because of the United Kingdom in World War I, and all of the import-export of sherry and port pretty much stopped because of World War I. And their biggest customer was the United Kingdom. And so World War I, near bankruptcy, and you had all these different people from different parts of the world coming to Australia to live. And they also brought other plant matter with them. So we saw people coming from Greece and Italy as well. And now we have those grape varietals there as well. So I just think it's really exciting. And this is just a really, really lovely wine. And I think sometimes when people think about Australia and think about the Barossa and think about the Coonawarra and the blend of Cabernet Sauvignon and Shiraz, they seem to have this thought and idea that it's going to be this really big, heavy, juicy, almost kind of full, weighty, almost too much for you on the palate, when actually the wines are not that. They're pretty sublime and they age really, really well. So it's actually one of my joys and my loves, this particular blend and style.
This is the one you've got in your glass. You've got the signature, correct?
Yes, I do.
There could have been any number of different wines. Through the lens of that, we can look at this. And I've always been a massive fan of this. There's so many great wines Yalumba makes, but that's always been a sneaky favorite of mine because while they talk about this, they've been making this officially for, I think they go back to the 60s with this. But if you're in the old cellar at Yalumba, there's a few bottles of old kind of claret from the early 1900s, like 1910, 1920, that when you speak to the owners, they're like, yeah, that's likely would have been a Cab Shiraz type of blend there. And I think, but I think you bring up a really interesting point, Tonya, about kind of the style. And I think Cabernet's a funny one in the sense that there's some lovely spots, and there's one of the oldest Cabernet vineyards on the planet is in the Barossa, although the Barossa overall is quite a bit too sort of warm for Cabernet, but in the right spot, it does bring together a really nice kind of tightness to the broadness of the fruit of Shiraz. And I think that's kind of why people historically in Australia, some of the old school winemakers are like, yeah, that's the blend, that's classic dry red wine. So yeah, I think it's a great style. And of course they've developed another wine over at the top of this to sort of as a kind of a benchmark example called the Cayley, which I think is also a brilliant wine. But yeah, there's any number of producers that are doing this, and sometimes they're not just Barossa based. They can be blends of. There was a tradition also of Barossa Shiraz with Coonawarra Cab. So they would take that multi-regional element, getting the best of Cabernet and the best of Shiraz in there. So that's kind of cool. Awesome. Yeah, and I think also there's been a style shift period in Australia and specifically in the Barossa. And I think that's something that I've noticed even over the last 10 years in the work that I've been doing, in that I think there was that period of time where there was heavy sort of oak, very extracted fruit, and that's changed. Picking times are different, approaches to oak are different, and there's a vibrancy I think that exists in the Barossa now, which I think probably in the past was a little bit harder to find, whereas now it's the norm. It's kind of cool. Less new oak and better new oak.
But when we were at Decanted one of the nights, which was more or less finale night, there were a lot of large formats, a lot of wines from the 70s and the 80s. And some of those styles that you speak of being more heavily oaked, much more generous and full mouthfeel, really did age very well. You knew when you tasted the wine that it had been a much bigger, robust wine, but to have it as it has been slumbering in the cellar and just hanging out and waiting, they're really, really super fantastic. And if no one has ever tried one, if you happen to see a bottle of Australian red blend, Cabernet Shiraz blend from the 80s and the 90s, grab it, have it, love it, because I think you'll be really pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, and I think there's I think there's always that issue, and I think California has struggled with this too, in the sense that those wines don't age very well, or this, because right. I think they're so delicious and fruit forward. It's almost like structurally they're a little bit different. The fruit's very obvious in the early days, and I think what quite often happens is that the structural complexity in some of these great older wines is sort of lost with the fruit a little bit, and that comes back out with time. So yeah, Paul, you're back with us.
I hope to God I am.
Technology is not helping out today. There you go. Okay, we're gonna keep this conversation moving along as well. But love this style, and I'm thrilled that you were excited about talking about it, Tonya. So thank you for that, and please jump in with additional comments if you like, Paul. Along those lines, because Barossa, even though you're going to sort of look at it through the lens of a classic d'Arenberg wine. But the reality is that Grenache-based blends in Australia, or Grenache itself and Shiraz just have such a storied history. But why don't we launch in and have a chat about that Shiraz, Grenache, Grenache, Shiraz, and that whole sort of piece of the puzzle?
Do you mind if I do some toast first, Mark?
Of course. You could do, Paul, you're in
People
charge.
of America. People of America, Canada, Australia, wherever the hell you are out there in this fair land of ours, raise your glass on this beautiful Tuesday. And you must toast Mark, who has these dulcet tones that I could turn off my video and just listen to him prattle on about. He could read the box scores for baseball, and I would be a happy goddamn camper. So, people of America, here's to Mark and to James. If you got to look beyond James, which I know is hard to do, and thank James for organizing his library this morning for all of our benefits, and to Tonya. Dare I say, Tonya, you need to move to the East Coast to New York because I need more of you in my life to become a kinder, gentler soul. I will confess that when the topic of this morning came up and it was blends, I thought it was going to be stainless steel Chardonnay combined with 100% new oak Chardonnay. You put that shit together and you get a blend. And then Mark threw me a curveball and said, no, Paul, they're reds. Okay, so I will give this a shot. And I do have one more toast. Tonya already mentioned him, but James Busby, the dude, who in 1832, before venturing back to Australia, I believe he went and visited the Oracle at Delphi and said to the folks at the Oracle at Delphi, what the hell am I doing with my life? And more specifically, what grape should I bring back to this incredible new country of ours? And with all due respect to, I don't know, the 10,000 other varieties he brought with him to this new country, he did bring Grenache. Maybe Mark can enlighten us if the Grenache specifically came from France or it did actually come from Spain. Mark, do you know that?
I don't actually know for sure, but I know that he didn't visit Spain. He visited. There were some varieties that came from South Africa on their way down, as they sort of bumped their way down back to around the Cape there. But he went to France specifically, and I think largely because in those days, the most famous place for wine in the 1800s, that was France, and so that's where he went. So my guess is that those, I could probably find out, but those vines would have come from France. I highly doubt he picked them up in South Africa, but it's not impossible.
So
Spain was not on his travels.
What little we know about Grenache, or dare I say it, what little I know, is that the first official vineyard, Australia, was in 1838. And unfortunately thereafter, Grenache fell into being an important part of the fortified wine world in this beautiful country. It crops huge. You get anywhere from 6 to 12 tons an acre. So they didn't treat it very well at all. They didn't know how great this goddamn grape was. And then it suffered in a massive vine pull in the mid-1980s. So the Australians themselves were not giving respect to this incredible grape. Like in all things, we have a spirit animal out there. Mine happens to be the narwhal. So, ladies and gentlemen, here's to the narwhal. And I think for Grenache, and specifically the Grenache blends that we're talking about today, it must be Charlie Melton, who created Nine Popes. I believe first year was 1988. And in the creation of that wine, he did realize what South Australia had in the ground, in the vineyards, these incredible old vines. Lest we forget, people of America, Canada, Mexico, and Australia, we honor history. We honor history through these wines that we engage with. And Australia has the oldest goddamn Grenache vines on the planet. I'll drink to that. But we need, I don't know what the correct word is here, something other to happen for us to end up with these incredible wines today. So much like in America, if it wasn't for Sutter Home, making white Zin, we may not have these incredible old vine Zin vineyards today. And it was Charlie Melton rediscovering this thing that stopped the uprooting of these Grenache vines because they were disappearing dramatically. Today, Grenache only accounts for roughly 1% of that country's grape harvest, but what they have is unbelievable shit. In that Nine Popes, of course, Charlie was trying to translate Chateauneuf-du-Pape. Let's say Charlie needs some help with his goddamn translation, because that's not how Chateauneuf-du-Pape translate. But this was his homage to that incredible wine, and it was that blending of Grenache, Shiraz, Mataro, aka Mourvedre, that set us off on this pathway forward. The wine that I have today, the D'Arenberg, the Dary's Original 2017, equal parts Shiraz, Grenache. I'm going to need Mark's help on this, because this one, this label first appeared in 1993. It was a renaming of a wine that D'Arenberg had been making for 50 odd years, called the D'Arenberg Burgundy, originally called Darren Burgundy, which I don't know is a marketing stroke of genius or disaster, but god damn it, what's in the glass? I look at the Grenache in these blends as being, it reminds me of my goth days. This was the dark underpinnings of the night at the club, and then you add a little bit, or in this case 50% Shiraz on top of this thing, and you get the brightness, the tonality, the lift, that there is some joy in your goth goddamn world. It's like Nirvana. Yes, it is heavy-hearted grunge shit. But if you listen and really listen, those are bright pop tunes. So, if only this blend helped to save these incredible old vine Grenache vineyards in this incredible country of Australia, I will raise my glass to that, people of America. Big cheers.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, you bring up an interesting point about Charlie Melton's understanding of what Chateauneuf-du-Pape translated into the popes of 9 chateaus. It was like, yeah, no, that's the new chateau of the Pope, buddy. But it's cool. It's a lovely part of Australian law, but it's interesting because he kind of popularized that, or made it a thing, made GSM a blend. Because you've got to remember, historically, we were talking Burgundy or a style. It was never about the varieties themselves. So he was the guy that kind of pushed that element. I'm going to come back to something else you said, because and it has nothing to do with a narwhal necessarily. But there are a couple of questions, and I'm hoping I can answer them. There's a question about, has the capture, as the style changed or the winemaking changed? And I think you can probably, I mean, you know, from producer to producer, there are differences. But I think overall, I'd say one thing, and that is oak usage, generally speaking, has shifted away from a heavy reliance on American oak. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but there was this old history, certainly in the Barossa, that the more American oak, the better. The fruit in Barossa, Shiraz can certainly suck up that American oak, and vice versa, you know. But that has changed, and there's a lot more use of different oak, combinations of French and American, or just straight French. So, and a lot less new proportion. So I think the proportion of new is less. I think picking times might just be one of the most critical things to the freshness element that exists in that blend. I think people picking a bit earlier, being a bit more cautious about that timing to, you know, not have overripe fruit, just have perfectly ripe fruit, I think has been the ticket. Pauline has asked a question: are there any varieties you can't imagine going in a blend? I think historically we could say that, but nowadays absolutely not. The people are, and I think that's been one of the curious elements that, outside of what we're talking today, if you were to think of, say, the natural wine movement, there's all sorts of things being blended together that you would never. It's just everything but the kitchen sink. So I'm not sure there's anything that can't work. I think from my perspective, if you don't want something too aromatic and floral and fruity, then probably don't pick things like muscat and Gewurz in there. But other than that, man, it's open season. I don't know if anyone else have any comments on that.
I am pretty enamored because you can find a lot of different varietals being grown. You know, Vermentino, Acertico, Sangiovese, Nebbiolo, all being grown in in Australia. And it's really exciting and it's pretty tasty stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a quick sip.
Ruminate on that.
I just had a quick sip of the Darrenberg, the Dowries Original. I've known this wine for years, as many people have, even back to the Burgundy days. But it was funny, Paul, you did mention that Darrenberg, it was the Darren Burgundy, and it was like, okay, yeah. And I think he was given a hard time. There's apparently, I've read something somewhere where one of the Penfolds family said to him at a meeting that I think you'll be ridiculed with that name, but he sort of stuck with it and still put it on the label, which is kind of funny because, yeah, it seems a bit gimmicky, but the Burgundy, yeah, it's a bit cutesy. But it's like you can see even in the iteration today, which I would argue is a fresher, more forward sort of style, you can see that sort of soft finish idea here, and that's what I think the Grenache brings beautifully to that blend, and lovely stuff. I think I've got all the questions. Steve, who does co-fermentation of grapes for red blends? Lots. I think probably the sort of a little off of what we're doing today, but we did discuss bringing this into the fold. Probably the hallmark benchmark example of the co-fermentation in Australia would have to be Clonakillas Shiraz Viognier. And that was started in the 90s, and that spurred a lot of people playing around with that co-fermentation idea. That's now sort of trimmed back down to a more manageable number in the sense that, you know, everyone was doing it for trend reasons. But the reality is that would be a very classic approach to it. That being said, I think, again, with the natural wine movement, the co-fermentation thing is less about, we're co-fermenting this for various reasons. It's just everything just gets done together as a kind of a sort of a field blend, if you like. So it exists. It absolutely exists. Question from Stephanie Jackenthal. There's a climate getting warmer. Do you find wineries are adjusting the percentage of varietals used in blends to keep wines fresh? Yep, that's happening. I think different varieties, as you just alluded to, Tonya, different varieties are making their way into their ground as a response to climate change. And I would argue that picking times for the classic varieties is where they're keeping the wines fresh. And new areas, or not new areas, but, you know, moving into cooler areas. There are parts of Tasmania, for example. This is a little off topic from here, but there's a gentleman who's in the Yarra Valley who's just bought property in Tasmania, who's planted property, and he's right on the fringe in Tasmania right now. And he's even said, I'll either be a genius or a goat. But the reality is that wouldn't have even been plantable 20, 30 years ago. Now it's like it's right on the fringe. So I think those are the sorts of things that people are doing to sort of combat a warming climate. And we're lucky in Australia in the sense that we've been aware of this for years, and we don't have the legislation that tightens it up to say that we can and can't do certain things, so we can get out and play around. Let's carry on. There are more questions. I will continue answering them as we go through. But James, I was with James in Australia, and we're in various places. But we're in the Yarra specifically, and the narrative of the Yarra, as you hear now, it's all about Pinot. And James, at one point after a Cabernet-based tasting, went, whoa, hang on a minute. What's going on here? I didn't know much about this. Yet that's actually the history, the old history of Yarra, are Cabernet-based blends, yet the modern discussion, the narrative is around Chardonnay and Pinot and sparkling wine. But James, you were completely enamored with them, and that's why I think it's kind of cool that you take us through a look of Cabernet-based blends in Australia, but through the lens of what's going on in Yarra.
Yeah, I think we're moving from sort of the less traditional worldwide blends in the Cab Shiraz through the Rhone blends into what is probably the most traditional type of blend, which is the Bordeaux blend. And I was shocked when we were in the Yarra. We did this large tasting of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and they were beautiful. Then the next morning we woke up, as I recall, rather earlier. Maybe I just felt like it was, and had this smaller tasting of other varieties and blends, and I walked away from the tasting with a distinct impression that if I wanted to drink something right then, it was the Bordeaux blends. And I think they are, to your point, Mark, some of the more traditional wines of the modern era in the Yarra. But I really find it interesting that there's this phenomenon around the world, I think, where we believe that the modern expression is not the traditional expression. For instance, in the Yarra, we don't think of Bordeaux blends as being the traditional Pinot Noir and Chardonnay as being the traditional expression. It's Bordeaux blends. But if you go back in the history, and we've all talked about history here, and I think that's important in Australia, is as much as we hear history other places, the long history that Australia has back to the early 1800s, especially of bringing in different types of vines. And you have, in the early mid 1830s and 1838 and 1839, Latrobe coming in with a Swiss wife because he had been stationed in Switzerland, and he convinced others to come to Australia, to the Yarra. And what are they bringing with them? Well, I had a long discussion with Sandra Dupury at Yeringberg, which I'm having their wine today. And they brought in not only Cabernet and Pinot and Chardonnay, but they brought in Chasselas and Gouais Blanc, which apparently was used to make wine for rations for the workers. So there's been this history of these different varieties being brought in for years, of course, as we talked about with Busby. But the wine that was most likely exported at that time, shortly thereafter, was Cabernet. But what were Swiss immigrants planting and using? Probably they were using the cooler climate varieties. As the climate has warmed, you do see much more emphasis on the Cabernet blends. Mm-hmm. So I find it interesting that we think of Cabernet blends as sort of the modern take, the history being of the modern take of Cabernet blends in the 60s and 70s when it was revived, and that Chardonnay and Pinot are the newest things, but they aren't necessarily. So it was an interesting tasting for me. I think it also speaks to what's happening around the world. We've seen it in the Dow, where Tempranillo is the new thing. Many people would say, oh, well, Jaén was, but in fact, Tempranillo possibly originated from there. So Yeringberg was one of the leaders of this. The vines were pulled out in 1921. Tanya has already spoken about the history and what has been going on with the fortified wines and the move to the fortified wines after World War I. And so in that, the Yarra kind of missed that whole fortified history. They couldn't produce fortified wines, and for that reason, there were 3 vintages or more backed up at Yeringberg, and in 1921, they pulled out the vines. They replanted in the 1960s, along with a number of other people, and since then, Cabernet and Cabernet blends have been important, but as the climate warmed, people also moved into the hills, where it was cooler, and Chardonnay and Pinot have sort of taken over. But the modern history is Cabernet blends. I think also if we look at Cab blends, we have to look at Margaret River, and a little bit different style, possibly more generous in some ways, firmer with more of a density to them, but with ripe tannins. And so I think if you compare the two areas, you sort of get Yarra with a little more acid structure, a little bit leaner, and more generosity in Margaret River. So doing Yeringberg's 2017 today, about 60% Cabernet Sauvignon.
Yeah, lovely stuff. I just had a quick sip of the Yeringberg, and I've said this more often than not, and it's so nice to be reminded that Cabernet-based wines can be gentle and medium to full-bodied as opposed to being quite full-bodied. James might be having some technical difficulties. I think he's clicking back in again. But I think I like that about Cabernet from the best areas in Australia, and it's grown in many areas, but if you think about the top areas for Cabernet-based blends, Coonawarra, Margaret River, and Yarra Valley are sitting kind of pretty high on that echelon. And I think this is a lovely example of that expressive kind of floral, aromatic, slightly herbaceous, but not transferring through on the palate, just that lovely lift of what is, I think, one of the characteristics that defines Cabernet, which is that slightly herbal lift. And And I love it. And I think I'm with James. I was completely enamored with on my first few trips to Yarra years ago. It was like, oh wow, hang on a second, Cabernet's really something worth spending some time looking at in Yarra for sure. We do have a couple of questions. One from Sid. We often wonder about if a blend is perhaps just leftover lots rather than purposeful combination. I think we're answering that question now. This is not really what I think. That's an older attitude, and I think that's where that probably stemmed. That was the attitude that sort of gave that idea that customers, I know when I was working as a sommelier, like, oh no, we don't want blends. It's like, oh, it's just leftovers. Like, no, it's actually a purpose. There's, without a doubt, it's about what's the style. And I think the comment about this sort of, what about the percentages, listing the percentages, I think I love the fact that blends are popular again now, simply because I think we've become so varietally obsessed that it's nice to sort of look at a style. And yes, of course, the varieties that go into that wine give it its character, and they're an important piece of the puzzle. But there is, and you can taste through all these three wines, for example, but any other examples of this style, and you can taste the McLaren Vale-ness, it's not quite a word, but I'm just making it up as I go, in that d'Arenberg wine. You can taste the Barossa-ness in that Cab Shiraz of Yalumba, and there is a Yarra quality that exists in that lift that happens there. So I think the regional expression is without a doubt coming through in these wines, and I think that's the exciting piece. And we're little or less, it's nice that people are moving away from, oh, I need to have a Cabernet. Well, do you? You just have a nice style, which I think it's kind of nice to see that sort of full circle coming back. But anyway, so yes, that to answer your question there, Paul Greco says, what's it like to travel with James? I think I'll answer that one privately, Paul. But actually, it was a pleasure. James is a pleasure to host because he's such a great person to have on the bus with other people on the trip, because he just has thoughtful, I like original thinkers, and James Tidwell's an original thinker, and that's why I like traveling with James. What's the long-term effect from John? Long-term effect of the fires in Australia. This particular vintage, we're learning a few things. We used to always think that the smoke in a vineyard is, a big issue post-veraison. We've now realized that with smoke hanging around as long as it did, there are other effects. But the regeneration ability of those vineyard sites is quite remarkable, and it's something we're all going to be dealing with, not just in Australia. We've historically dealt with it in Australia, and we bounce back. And I think that's the beautiful thing about vines, is they bounce back really quickly. So, and only 1%, while some areas got hit harder than others, if you look at the entire vineyard area of Australia during the bushfires, 1% got burnt and affected, maybe a bit bigger affected with smoke taint. But so overall, we were lucky. That's not to take away from the devastation that existed as a result of those fires. But from the wine perspective, we were quite lucky. Have I covered all? We have a Critter Brand question here from Michael Murphy in Connecticut. Hello, Michael from Connecticut. We are in a distribution business struggling with the bastardization of Australian wine due to the Critter Brands, as well as Malbec taking the place of Shiraz by the glass. This is the worldwide pandemic. How do we get the public to understand that Australian wine is better than a kangaroo? Honestly, Mike, with all due respect, I think it's a market issue, and I think these things have been changing rapidly over the last 10 years. And pre-pandemic, one of the cities that I loved the most was New York, because, man, great Australian wines were showing up in all corners of the New York market. Paul, you've been doing great stuff with Australian wine for a long time, but in different places where you'd go in and go, wow, this is an awesome wine list, and it's heavily populated with really cool, interesting, contemporary and classic wines from Australia. So I think it is a market-to-market discussion, but maybe the other guys jump in and see what you think to answer that question. I think the Critter Brand thing, which is a successful piece of the Aussie business, I don't want to negate that, but the reality is that I think that discussion has changed. But please, I'd like you guys to throw in your two bobs worth. Tonya.
I think that the more you taste and experience different styles of wine, and you figure out whether or not it can work in your program. For me, it's always been, the wine's delicious, but does it work with what's coming out of the kitchen? And can I get everyone else on board with me? Because I don't want to be hand selling everything myself, although I've been known to do that anyway, when I really love something and just want to turn people onto it, but you're not forcing it down, someone's throat. The thing is to have someone taste it and try it. And then they have that aha, moment, because you have to distill whatever they are thinking or what they've thought, before in the past. And it's just about, educating people, Yeah.
Paul.
I am a big fan of forcing shit down people's throat. Let me just begin there. So, I grant that
Why we love you so much.
Sector, that it might be in the restaurant sector, but certainly
totally agree.
On the by the glass list, where we have a ton of wines by the glass, I don't write Australia. I write the region writ large, or the hyper-specific small appellation that most people may not know where in the goddamn wine world it is from. And so with that, being not totally transparent, I could be accused of, they ask, well, what's that? And then in having these conversations, as Tanya just said, Tanya being the nice, gentle one in this conversation today, with all due respect to you, James, is that you get them to taste it, and then things take off from there. I understand why we stereotype broad swaths of this industry, and I would like to think in 2020, why are we still doing that goddamn stuff? Why does the word critter have to come up in these conversations? Today, when we talk about Germany, no one under 50 years of age mentions the word balloon nut. When we talk about Portugal today, no one under 60 years of age mentions Matus. When we talk about Italy today, no one under 50 years of age says Suave Bola. So God damn it, people of America, the word critter should be stricken from our conversations, and put Australia up there, give them as much goddamn incisive information, and as Tanya said, let them try the wine or talk to them about the wine in the same way as you would from the more usual places where it's easier to sell your wine. And I think the doors for Aussie Juice will be open broadly, because they damn well should be.
Great point there, Paul, because that historical perspective on other styles of wine from different parts of the world is so true. It sort of ebbs and flows. And I think, we are in a place right now as drinkers of wine in the world. We've never been in a better place. Think about all the countries, never mind regions, that were insignificant when all of us started in the wine business that are now, Sicily. Is there a more exciting place? It was Corvo Bianco, Corvo Rosso, and Shitty Masala when I was a young sommelier. It's all changed, and I think that those narratives do have to adjust. A couple of quick questions here, because I'm a bit mindful of the time here, but hopefully that answers the question, Michael. Nathaniel's got a good one on when do you think the rest of the world will be looking to Australian Cabernet Sauvignon Shiraz blends as a reference point to mimic and idolize, as we've seen with French blends? Yeah, that's a good question. I think I would probably say that mimicry is a nice form of flattery, but I think Australia has gone through its periods of mimicry to the point where we are making more authentic wines because we know now what's going on in other parts of the world. We're not as concerned about trying to make wines like that part of the world. We're just curious about what's going on there. What can we best do with what's happening here? And I'm not sure if that's where your question was going, but I like the confidence in what's happening. I think it's showing in the glass with Australian wines now, because it's not trying to be something other than what it is. So I'm not sort of mimicry. I think ultimately it's the flattery that's awesome about mimicry, and it's like, wow, you've got this sort of thing that you're trying to sort of idolize and copy. But in the end, the best wines of the world don't try and mimic somewhere else. But anyone else want to add to that mimicry comment?
So the first thing that comes to mind is basically Hunter Valley, Simeon. You know where you are, and it's very exciting. And you're not going to find a bottle of wine, glass of wine that tastes like that anywhere. That's specific to where it's coming from, period. So, it's being itself. All of the wines are. It's not trying to be anyone else.
Yeah, I think there's a confidence with Australia and Australian winemakers and marketers now to really make wines of the place. I mean, if you look at the wines that we're going through today, each one of these blends is sort of known to be from 1, 2, 3 places, and they don't overlap that much. I mean, the comment about the second tier fruit going into the Cabernet blends idea, that probably is most relevant in Coonawarra, where you don't really Merlot and some other grapes don't do as well as Cabernet necessarily, and so you see more straight Cabernet. Whereas if you look at the Yarra or Margaret River, those have had Cabernet blends from basically the beginning of their time, and so I think the confidence to make wines of the place that they do well is much more prevalent now, rather than trying to mimic something or go after a marketing trend necessarily.
Yeah. And I think maybe Nathaniel was the question was, when are people going to mimic Australia? I think that probably has happened to a degree, but yeah, I think onwards. Quick question about wild ferments from Chris Wilton. Are wild ferments, partial wild ferments, more marketing than actual winemaking? I don't know. Anyone got a comment? I've got my comments on that. I've always got comments on everything apparently, but maybe other people could jump in. Because it is something in Australia for sure that is more prevalent, in the sense that it's about, I think it's just a nod to this less interventional winemaking, even from a large winery. It's like, well, actually the ferment's going to start itself. Let's just let that go. That brings on different flavors and different textures. So I think that's happening. I'm not sure if it's marketing so much as it's just an evolution of practices. But, do you guys have comments on that? Anyone?
I don't think it's marketing. I think it's a decision that the winemaker, makes when he's, producing the wine. It's not a marketing thing. It's what does the plant matter? What does the grape material need? And going to show best for itself. It's not marketing.
No,
that's not what that is. No.
Paul, you look like you've got something to say.
I'm just thinking about James's library. Okay, I'm done. I would say that if it's an example of less is more, if it's an example of we're spending more time in the vineyards, doing much better work than we've ever done, so that yeast population in that vineyard, when gotten to the winery, can do better work. Massive fan. Is it the sole definition of wine success in this day and age? No, because there are some great wines in the world, I'll speak of Germany, that must begin with some of those cultured yeasts just to get going, the fruitier expression, so to speak. So it's not marketing at all. It's less is more. Big goddamn applause.
I think it depends on what you mean by wild ferment. I mean, if you're in a winery that's been making wines for decades, and you've been using inoculated yeast, that's the population in the winery. That yeast strain will be in the winery. It might have adapted, but it'll be in the winery. What are you talking about when you say wild ferment? I was at a Lallemand seminar a couple of years ago, and we always think of true wild yeast, not typical wine yeast, as not making it through the ferments. But Lallemand did experiments, and there were, I think, somewhere if I recall correctly, in the range of 18 different subspecies of yeast that made it all the way through the ferments. So they definitely have an effect on the wine. So it depends on yes, it could be a marketing thing, but it does have an actual effect. So I don't think it's pure marketing.
No. I mean, people follow trends and everything. But question from Peter Bodnerod, old friend of mine from Toronto. Nice to see you up here, Peter. Not to hijack, but hey, Chinese wine tariffs, it's been a big discussion. Yes, obviously that's not, I'm going to keep this very brief, not a lovely topic for us to talk about, but yeah, it's going to have a major impact for people, for us exporting wine to China. We are hopeful that these are temporary, but right now that's not a great thing. So we're hopeful, fingers crossed, that this is something that can be resolved in the short term rather than this being a long term. I mean, we've seen it here with the tariffs on French wines at 25%, but the 107 to 200% tariffs that are being instituted, that's a lot of politics and stuff that, we're not going to get into here. But yeah, it's not a good thing. It's not a great thing for us. So we're hopeful for a quick resolution. Where was another question in here? No, I think we've covered most of them. Thank God for master sommeliers to speak the truth and the fact. I think he's talking about you, James. And he says that the ancients are jealous of your library.
Yes.
I'm not sure who the ancients are. Those are people over 50.
I'm jealous of Paul's wine list. And by the way, congratulations, Paul, on the World of Fine Wine World's Best Wine List Award.
Oh, congratulations. Cool.
Yeah.
When did this happen?
Yesterday.
Oh, well, come on. Do a little boasting. For crying out loud.
Man.
Toast to you, Paul.
Yeah. Toast to you.
So,
Well, thank you very much. And thank God the restaurant's closed, so we don't have to celebrate this award. But when we reopen at some point in the future,
Yeah.
we will fly that flag very high. We're super duper honored. And all we are trying to do in our little world, our ship estate here, is represent the entirety of the goddamn world of wine, which, as Mark has already said, is greater than it has ever been. And we love that shit.
Yeah, it is. It's there's never been a better time to be a drinker of wine than now.
Yeah.
With every corner of the globe, there are so many great wines. We're down to the last couple of minutes, but there is a couple of questions. I'll try and get into this. Are there any experimental vineyards, winemaking happening in non-traditional areas such as Northern Territory or northern parts of Western Australia, etc.? Yes, things are moving into other areas, but not that direction, Bill. That's too far north. So generally speaking, we are moving to cooler areas within regions that do exist, or sometimes just on the outskirts of places like Yarra and places in parts of Tasmania. So yes, lots of experimental vineyards. Too much to mention now, but absolutely. But it's more about long-term sustainability. So it tends to not be far north, too tropical, too hot up north. When are you coming to London to celebrate, Paul? That's from Pauline Vickard. Maybe you know her. I don't know if you do, but she wants you to come to London.
Arini Group.
When the pandemic settles.
Arini Global.
Awesome. I want to thank all of you. We have 1 minute left. If there are any questions, flip them in there quickly. We'll get to them. I want to individually thank you, Tonya, Paul, and James, for spending time with us this morning. Particularly want to thank my colleague, Christy Frank, who did all the back-end work in setting this. I get to just set up here and have a chat with you guys, but she's the one that did all the hard work setting up this webinar and getting the technology correct, getting everyone's bios and things. So, Christy, thank you so much to you. Stay tuned. Every few months, we're going to pull something together for the general populace, focusing on some topic of Australian wine that we find interesting and compelling. I hope you found this one fun and entertaining. Let me quickly cover a few things for all of you. Remember, the link to that recording will be coming your way. Don't forget to go to our website, australianwinediscovered.com. That's where all the action is. And lots of some of the top topics that we discussed today can be found on australianwinediscovered.com. Any questions I didn't get to, which I think we did a pretty good job, I'll send afterwards, and you'll be receiving a link following this to a survey. It'd be awesome if your participants would take the couple of minutes that it requires for you guys to fill out the survey. It's always good for us to get feedback. Thank you very much. And yeah, enjoy the rest of what's going to be a lovely day. Thank you very much, guys. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Big cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.